The curvy black maid electrocuted the billionaire's wife. What he did next will leave you in tears.
Please, please.
In this grand billionaire penthouse overlooking Manhattan, everything looks flawless, the skyline glittering like diamonds, the luxury cars humming below, the empire built on finance, real estate, and technology. But perfection is only a mask. Behind the glass walls lies a secret so dangerous it could destroy everything. Tonight, betrayal sparks in the most unexpected way, and one shocking twist will leave you breathless. Stay until the end, because what happens inside this mansion proves that karma always comes back stronger than money, stronger than power, stronger than love. The story begins with Richard Coleman, a self-made billionaire whose empire stretches across Wall Street investments, luxury real estate, and cutting-edge technology firms. His penthouse is the envy of New York, marble floors, priceless art, and a rooftop garden that touches the clouds. To the outside world, Richard is untouchable. But inside, cracks are forming. His wife, Elizabeth, comes from a powerful political family, her influence woven into government contracts that fuel Richard's empire. Their marriage is more alliance than romance, a union of power and ambition. Yet Richard's heart strays toward Sophia, the maid whose quiet beauty and warmth offer him something Elizabeth never could. As the city lights flicker outside, Richard whispers promises to Sophia in shadowed corridors, unaware that Elizabeth already suspects. The tension builds like static in the air. Every glance, every secret meeting, every flicker of light foreshadows the storm to come. And then, a sudden surge of electricity rattles the mansion's lights, a chilling omen of the betrayal that will ignite. Richard Coleman's empire may glitter in the daylight, but at night, shadows tell a different story. The penthouse corridors echo with footsteps that shouldn't be there. Sophia, the maid, moves quietly, her presence both comforting and dangerous. Richard's whispers to her are promises of escape, of a life beyond the cold alliance he shares with Elizabeth. But Elizabeth is no ordinary wife. Her family's political dynasty has eyes everywhere, and her intuition is sharper than any detective's. She notices the subtle changes, Richard's late nights, the way Sophia avoids her gaze, the flicker of guilt in Richard's smile. Elizabeth begins to weave her own plan, one that will turn suspicion into undeniable proof. Meanwhile, Richard's closest friend and business partner, Daniel Harris, senses the tension. Daniel has built fortunes alongside Richard in finance and technology, but he knows betrayal when he sees it. He warns Richard, "You're playing with fire. Elizabeth isn't the kind of woman you cross." Richard laughs it off, blinded by desire, but Daniel's words linger like a prophecy. The city outside hums with luxury, Wall Street traders, real estate moguls, tech innovators, but inside the penthouse, the air grows heavy. Every glance between Richard and Sophia is a risk. Every silence from Elizabeth is a storm waiting to break. And then, one evening, Elizabeth makes a call. Her voice is calm, but her words are lethal. "I want the truth. And if I don't get it, I'll take everything from him, the money, the empire, the name." The betrayal is no longer hidden. It's a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when power, love, and revenge collide. Elizabeth Coleman had always been the quiet force behind Richard's empire. While Richard dazzled Wall Street investors and technology moguls with his charisma, Elizabeth's family connections in Washington ensured the contracts kept flowing. But now, her silence was no longer loyalty, it was strategy. She sat in her private study, the city skyline glowing behind her, reviewing documents that could dismantle Richard's fortune in a single stroke. Her father's influence in government meant she had access to information Richard never imagined she could wield. And she intended to use it. Elizabeth's suspicions about Sophia were no longer whispers in her mind. She had proof, photographs taken by a private investigator she hired discreetly. Images of Richard and Sophia together in the penthouse corridors, their closeness undeniable. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she held them, not from weakness, but from the fury of betrayal. Meanwhile, Richard remained blind to the storm brewing. He continued to meet Sophia in secret, promising her a future filled with luxury and freedom. Sophia, torn between desire and fear, asked him one night, "What if Elizabeth finds out?" Richard smirked, arrogance dripping from his words, "She won't. She needs me too much." But Elizabeth was already setting her trap. She began moving assets quietly, shifting ownership of properties, freezing accounts Richard didn't know she controlled. She reached out to Daniel Harris, Richard's partner, with a chilling proposition: help me, and you'll keep your empire. Stand against me, and you'll lose everything. Daniel hesitated, torn between loyalty to Richard and the undeniable power Elizabeth wielded. He knew one thing: the war inside the Coleman penthouse was about to explode, and whoever survived would control not just the fortune, but the legacy. The lights flickered again that night, a reminder that electricity, and betrayal, can strike without warning. Daniel Harris had always been Richard's right hand. Together they had built empires in finance, technology, and luxury real estate, their names whispered in boardrooms and splashed across headlines. But now, Daniel stood at a crossroads. Elizabeth's proposition echoed in his mind: help me, and you'll keep your empire. Stand against me, and you'll lose everything. Daniel knew Elizabeth wasn't bluffing. Her family's political dynasty had the power to freeze contracts, redirect government deals, and dismantle Richard's fortune overnight. He had seen her influence firsthand, and the thought of being on the wrong side of it chilled him. Yet Richard was more than a partner, he was a friend, a brother in ambition. Betraying him felt like betraying himself. But loyalty has limits, especially when billions are at stake. Daniel began to weigh the risks. Richard's obsession with Sophia was reckless, a distraction that threatened everything they had built. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was calculating, controlled, and ruthless. Aligning with her meant survival. Aligning with Richard meant destruction. One evening, Daniel met Elizabeth in a quiet corner of a luxury hotel bar. The city's neon lights reflected in her eyes as she slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, contracts, bank transfers, evidence of Richard's hidden dealings. "This is your insurance," she whispered. "With me, you win. With him, you lose." Daniel's hands trembled as he closed the folder. He knew the choice he made tonight would decide the future of the empire. And as he walked out into the cold Manhattan air, he realized something terrifying: betrayal wasn't just Richard's sin anymore. It was his too. The storm inside the Coleman empire had found its second traitor. Richard Coleman had always believed himself untouchable. His empire stretched across Manhattan's skyline, his name carried weight in boardrooms, and his fortune seemed limitless. Yet lately, he felt something he hadn't in years: unease. It began with small things. A government contract that should have been renewed was suddenly delayed. A luxury real estate deal collapsed without explanation. His technology firm faced unexpected audits. Richard brushed it off at first, blaming market volatility, but deep down he knew these weren't coincidences. Someone was pulling strings against him. Sophia noticed his tension. She found him pacing the penthouse balcony one night, staring at the city lights with clenched fists. "You're worried," she whispered. Richard forced a smile, but his voice betrayed him. "Elizabeth is moving against me. I can feel it." The thought gnawed at him. Elizabeth had always been the silent partner, the political force behind his empire. If she turned, everything could crumble. Richard began to suspect Daniel too. His partner's calls had grown shorter, his meetings more evasive. Richard replayed their last conversation in his mind, Daniel's warning echoing, "You're playing with fire." The penthouse itself seemed to betray him. Lights flickered more often, the hum of electricity carrying an ominous weight. Richard felt as though the mansion was alive, warning him of the storm ahead. Determined to regain control, Richard called an emergency meeting with his advisors. But as he sat at the head of the long marble table, he realized something terrifying: half the seats were empty. Allies who once fought for his empire were now silent, absent, or worse, aligned with Elizabeth. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt powerless. And in that moment, he understood: betrayal wasn't coming. It was already here. Elizabeth Coleman had always played the long game. While Richard basked in the glow of his empire, she quietly pulled the strings that kept it alive. Now, she was cutting those strings one by one. Government contracts Richard depended on were suddenly redirected to competitors. Luxury real estate deals he had lined up collapsed under mysterious zoning disputes. His technology firm faced relentless investigations, each one backed by Elizabeth's unseen influence. Richard's empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. Sophia noticed the change. The penthouse, once filled with lavish parties and endless champagne, grew quiet. Richard's phone calls turned frantic, his voice sharp with desperation. "They're coming after me," he muttered one night, pacing the marble floors. Sophia tried to soothe him, but her own fear grew. She had fallen for a man who was losing everything. Meanwhile, Elizabeth moved with precision. She met Daniel Harris again, this time in her father's private office downtown. She laid out the full plan. Richard would be stripped of his contracts, his assets frozen, his reputation destroyed. "When the dust settles," she said coldly, "you and I will control what's left." Daniel hesitated, but the evidence was undeniable. Richard's empire was already bleeding, and Elizabeth held the knife. Aligning with her wasn't betrayal anymore, it was survival. Back at the penthouse, Richard began to sense the truth. Elizabeth's silence wasn't ignorance, it was war. He confronted her one evening, his voice trembling with rage. "You're tearing me apart." Elizabeth's reply was calm, almost chilling. "No, Richard. You tore yourself apart the moment you betrayed me." The lights flickered again, longer this time, as if the mansion itself was warning him. The trap had closed, and Richard Coleman was running out of time. Richard Coleman had never been a man to surrender. For decades, he had clawed his way to the top of Manhattan's financial towers, outsmarting rivals and crushing competitors. Now, with his empire crumbling, he refused to go down quietly. He began by calling in favors. Old allies from Wall Street, real estate tycoons, and technology innovators were summoned to the penthouse. Richard promised them returns, whispered of new ventures, and begged for loyalty. But the room was colder than he expected. Men who once toasted his victories now avoided his gaze. Elizabeth's influence was everywhere, and Richard could feel it choking him. Sophia watched him unravel. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he signed documents, the sleepless nights pacing the balcony. "You're losing them," she whispered. Richard snapped back, his voice sharp, "I'll win them back. I always do." But even he didn't believe his words. Determined to strike back, Richard launched a bold move. He transferred millions into a secret account, planning to fund a new technology startup that could outshine Elizabeth's sabotage. He believed innovation could save him, that one breakthrough could restore his empire. But Elizabeth was already ahead. Within days, regulators froze the account, citing suspicious activity. Richard's lifeline was severed before it began. Daniel Harris, once his closest ally, delivered the final blow. In a tense boardroom meeting, Daniel sided openly with Elizabeth, announcing that Richard's leadership was no longer viable. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. Richard stared at Daniel, his voice trembling, "You were my brother." Daniel's reply was cold, "You chose desire over empire. I chose survival." The penthouse lights flickered violently that night, as if mocking Richard's downfall. His counterattack had failed, and the storm was now unstoppable. The Coleman penthouse had always been a symbol of power, marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and walls lined with priceless art. But tonight, it felt more like a cage. Richard paced the living room, his empire slipping through his fingers, his allies abandoning him one by one. Sophia tried to calm him, but her words were drowned out by the hum of electricity that seemed louder than usual. Elizabeth had orchestrated every downfall with precision, but she wasn't finished. She wanted Richard broken, not just financially, but emotionally. She arranged a dinner, inviting Daniel and several key associates. Richard, desperate to prove he still had control, agreed. The atmosphere was tense, every smile hiding daggers. As the evening unfolded, Elizabeth's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Richard's agitation. She spoke of new ventures, contracts, and opportunities, all without Richard. Daniel nodded in agreement, his loyalty now firmly with her. Richard's fury boiled over. He slammed his glass down, shouting, "This is my empire. You can't erase me." The lights flickered violently, the hum of electricity growing louder. Sophia gasped as sparks danced across the chandelier above. Richard stormed toward the control panel, determined to prove he was still in command. But in his rage, he didn't notice the trap Elizabeth had set. A surge ripped through the system. The room erupted in chaos as Richard touched the panel. Sparks exploded, electricity coursed, and Richard collapsed, his body convulsing under the shock. Gasps filled the room, Sophia screamed, Daniel froze, and Elizabeth simply watched, her expression unreadable. The Empire's king had fallen, not by rivals on Wall Street, but by betrayal inside his own home. And as the lights steadied, the silence was deafening. The penthouse was no longer alive with power. The chandelier that once sparkled with brilliance now hung dim, its light subdued after the violent surge. Richard lay motionless, his Empire's king brought down not by rivals in boardrooms, but by betrayal inside his own home. Sophia knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. Her cries echoed through the marble halls, a haunting reminder of the love she had risked everything for. She clutched his hand, whispering his name, but the silence was deafening. The man who had promised her freedom, luxury, and escape was gone, leaving only shattered dreams. Elizabeth stood across the room, her expression cold, her posture unshaken. To her, this was not tragedy, it was justice. She had endured humiliation, betrayal, and deception, and now she had reclaimed control. Her voice cut through the silence, this is the price of betrayal. And now, the Empire is mine. Daniel Harris, shaken but resolute, realized the full weight of his choice. He had sided with Elizabeth, and now there was no turning back. He watched Sophia's grief, torn between guilt and relief. Richard's downfall meant survival, but it also meant blood on his hands. The city outside continued its rhythm, Wall Street traders, luxury cars, neon lights, oblivious to the storm that had consumed the Coleman penthouse. Inside, the Empire had shifted. Richard was gone, Sophia was broken, Daniel was compromised, and Elizabeth stood victorious. Yet even in victory, Elizabeth felt the faint sting of emptiness. Power had been restored, but love was forever lost. The penthouse, once a symbol of ambition, now carried the weight of betrayal, grief, and silence. The storm had passed, but its scars would never fade. The Coleman penthouse stood silent, its marble halls echoing with the weight of betrayal. Richard was gone, his empire shattered, his promises to Sophia dissolved into grief. Elizabeth had won, or so it seemed. In the days that followed, Elizabeth moved swiftly. She consolidated contracts, secured government deals, and placed Daniel Harris at the helm of Richard's former companies. The empire was reborn under her control, stronger and more ruthless than ever. To the outside world, she was the Queen of Manhattan, a woman who had survived betrayal and emerged victorious. But inside, cracks began to show. Sophia, broken yet resilient, refused to disappear. She filed a lawsuit, armed with evidence of Richard's promises and Elizabeth's manipulations. The media swarmed, headlines screaming of scandal, betrayal, and corruption. Elizabeth's carefully crafted image began to crumble. Daniel, too, found himself haunted. The empire he now controlled felt poisoned, every deal tainted by the memory of Richard's downfall. He began to question whether survival was worth the cost of betrayal. His nights grew restless, his conscience heavy. And then came the final twist. A hidden clause in Richard's will surfaced, one Elizabeth had overlooked. It granted Sophia a controlling share in one of Richard's most valuable companies, a technology firm poised to dominate the future. Overnight, Sophia transformed from maid to mogul, her grief replaced by power. Elizabeth's victory dissolved into ashes. The empire she thought she owned slipped from her grasp, handed to the very woman she had tried to erase. Karma had crowned Sophia, proving that betrayal may win battles, but it never wins the war. The penthouse lights flickered one last time, as if the mansion itself acknowledged the truth, power is fleeting, but justice always finds its way home.